The farewell dinner at Hartwell House had been planned to the last detail. 17 guests, 4 courses, the good silver polished and set out by Thursday morning. The flowers arranged by Dorothea herself on Friday afternoon, because the florist had sent lilies when she had requested ranunculus, and there was simply no time to send them back. She stood at the far end of the dining table now, attending to Lady Ashworth's description of her daughter's recent confinement, and she smiled at precisely the right moments and offered precisely the right words of congratulation. And she did not once glance toward the head of the table where her husband sat, because after 14 years, she no longer needed to look at him to know exactly what he was doing. He was speaking to Lord Pemberton about the wool trade. She knew this without looking because Lord Pemberton had been placed beside him specifically for this purpose, the wool trade being Lord Pemberton's particular enthusiasm and the Duke of Hartwell's particular area of parliamentary concern, and she had arranged the seating accordingly, as she arranged everything. This was what Dorothea Crane, Duchess of Hartwell, did. She arranged. At 43, she had become the most efficient woman in a county known for efficient women. The Hartwell estates, 3 of them, ran with a precision that other men's solicitors studied and admired. The household accounts were immaculate. The tenants were well kept. The children, their eldest, James, now 17 and already at Oxford, their youngest, William, 10 and due to leave for school the following morning, were healthy, well-read, and possessed of better manners than half the aristocracy. She had not done this alone, of course. She had an excellent housekeeper, a capable butler, reliable men of business, but the direction had always been hers. The decisions, hers. The quiet management of every detail, hers. What she had not been given in 14 years was anyone to notice. She had not married Elliot Crane for love. She had understood this going in. She had been 9 and 20, which was considered a rather alarming age to still be unmarried, and her family's situation had grown complicated enough that a practical resolution was required. Elliot had needed a capable wife. His first engagement, 9 years earlier, had dissolved under unhappy circumstances he never discussed, and whatever feeling he had once possessed for matrimony seemed to have been buried with that silence. He had presented her with a straightforward arrangement. She had accepted with clear eyes. What she had not anticipated was how thorough the silence would be. Not cruelty. She wanted to be precise about this. He was never unkind. He was never sharp with her in company or dismissive of her opinions to her face. He was simply elsewhere, even when he was in the same room. Across the table, Lady Ashworth was describing a new style of confectionery she had encountered in Bath. Dorothea smiled and agreed it sounded delightful, and the candles burned lower in their stands. And tomorrow morning, William would get into the carriage and go, and the house would be quieter than it had ever been. She had been thinking about Wales for 6 months. Her late aunt had left her a cottage there, in a small village near the coast, and she had visited precisely once, 12 years ago, in the first year of her marriage, when Elliot had been occupied elsewhere and she had gone alone with her sketchbook and spent a week in uninterrupted silence that she had thought about almost every day since. She had not mentioned Wales to anyone. This was, she reflected, the most revealing fact of all, that she had been planning a private departure for 6 months and there was no one in this house she expected to notice. William's carriage left at 8:30 on Saturday morning. Dorothea stood on the front steps of Hartwell House and watched it go, and kept her expression pleasant until the carriage turned the corner and disappeared, because one did not weep on front steps in full view of the street. She was the Duchess of Hartwell. She had learned, a long time ago, how to move a feeling from her face into some quieter interior room and close the door. The Duke had said goodbye to William in the entrance hall, briefly and warmly, with a particular brand of gruff affection that was as much as he seemed to know how to give. He had already retreated to his study by the time the carriage pulled away. Dorothea went upstairs. She told her lady's maid, Ellen, that she required a trunk packed for a fortnight for Wales, and that they would depart Monday morning. Ellen, who had been with her for 11 years and had learned not to express surprise, went to fetch the trunk. On Sunday evening, Dorothea wrote a brief note in her precise and elegant hand, and left it on the small table in the entrance hall where the daily correspondence was sorted. I have gone to Aunt Marjorie's cottage in Wales for a fortnight's rest. The housekeeper holds all instructions for the household. The solicitor holds the estate accounts as usual. I trust all will be well. Dorothea. She did not write. I need to remember who I was before I became so invisible. She did not write. I'm going because the alternative is to stand in this house for another 14 years and watch myself disappear entirely. She simply wrote her name and left before sunrise, and the house received her absence as it received most things, in perfect, untroubled silence. She was gone 3 days before Elliot noticed. Or rather, he noticed several things before he identified the source of them: that the morning room was not arranged the way he liked it, that a letter he needed had not been sorted from the day's post, that his evening schedule for the week had not appeared on his desk as it invariably did on Monday mornings. He mentioned this to his butler on Tuesday afternoon with some irritation. "Her Grace has gone to Wales, Your Grace," his butler said, with an expression of perfect neutrality that somehow communicated an entire speech Elliot was quite certain he deserved. He stood in the corridor outside his study for a long moment after the butler withdrew. Wales. He read her note, which had been sitting in the entrance hall since Sunday. He read it twice. He read it a third time and tried to identify precisely what it was that was sitting in his chest like a stone, because he could not name it, and Elliot Crane was a man who named things. He called for his carriage at first light Wednesday morning. The cottage was smaller than he had imagined. He stood before it in the early afternoon of a grey April day, the Welsh hills rising behind it and the smell of sea air sharp on the wind, and he noted that it was perhaps 1/5 the size of the smallest of the Hartwell properties, with a low gate and a garden that showed signs of having been very recently and energetically worked, and a single thin column of smoke rising from the chimney. Before he could reach the gate, the front door opened. Dorothea stood in the doorway. She was wearing a dress he had never seen before, a practical thing in a shade of blue-gray wool, without ornament, without the particular formal arrangement she wore in London, and her dark hair, touched at the temples with silver now, was pinned simply, and she looked at him for a moment with an expression that passed through surprise and settled very quickly into something careful and composed. "Elliot," she said. "Dorothea," he said. There was a pause that contained, he felt, approximately 14 years of things neither of them had said. "You had better come in," she said, and held the door open and stepped aside. The sitting room held a single sofa, 2 chairs, a fireplace burning with the competent efficiency he now recognized as her specific signature, and a small table by the window on which lay a sketchbook, open. He did not comment on the sketchbook. He sat in the chair she gestured toward and accepted the tea that appeared, produced by a small and frankly skeptical-looking maid who seemed to disapprove of him on instinct. "You came to retrieve me," Dorothea said. It was not quite a question. "No," he said, and was almost as surprised as she appeared to be. "I came because—" He stopped. "I am not entirely certain why I came." She looked at him. She had very direct eyes, grey-brown, and he had spent 14 years in reasonable proximity to them without, he was beginning to understand, ever quite meeting them. "You may stay for 3 days," she said at last. "The cottage has a 2nd bedroom. Ellen will make it up." "That is 3 days, Elliot, after which I would like my fortnight to remain my own." 3 days, he agreed. He stayed for 11. He could not afterwards explain this adequately, except that each morning arrived before he had arranged his reasons for leaving, and each evening settled around them before he had thought to act on them. And somewhere between the 1st day and the 11th, the cottage had rearranged itself around both of them in a way that would have been difficult to disturb. It was the sketchbook that undid him first. He came downstairs on the 2nd morning to find the sitting room empty and the front door open, and Dorothea outside in the garden in the early light, seated on a low stool with the sketchbook balanced on her knee, drawing the line of hills against the sky with a concentration he had never once seen on her face in any London drawing room. He stood in the doorway for a long moment without speaking. She drew with her whole body leaning slightly forward, her head tilted, and there was something in her expression, an absorption, a private intensity that he recognized abstractly as what it looked like when a person was being entirely themselves. He retreated before she could see him watching. He made tea. He made it badly and was aware of this and did not mention it. "The tea is undrinkable," she said, coming in from the garden 20 minutes later. "I suspected as much. The water must boil completely. You've poured it too early." She took the pot from him without ceremony and tipped it out and started again, and he watched her quick, efficient movements and thought, "I have no idea how many things she knows how to do that I have simply never observed." "How long have you drawn?" he asked. She paused. The question seemed to catch her off guard, which he noted meant it was a question he had never asked before. "Since I was a girl," she said. "I stopped for some years. I've begun again." He did not ask her why she had stopped. He was afraid the answer would be one he was not yet ready to hold. They established over those first days an accidental rhythm. He rose early and attempted, and failed at, various domestic tasks, which she corrected without comment, but with a dryness that he found, unexpectedly, made him want to attempt them again simply to observe it. She drew in the mornings. She read in the afternoons. Serious things, a history of the Welsh borders, a volume of essays on botanical classification, a much annotated copy of Wollstonecraft that raised one of his eyebrows considerably. "You've read that before?" he said, noting the annotations. "Several times." She turned a page without looking up. The margins are mine." He looked at the neat, confident handwriting crowding the margins and thought that he had lived with this woman for 14 years and had apparently had no idea at all who she was. On the 5th day, it rained, a grey Welsh rain that made the garden unsuitable and the cottage feel smaller than ever. And they found themselves on opposite sides of the sitting room fire with books neither of them was quite reading. "What was it like?" he asked eventually. "The first years, when James was small." She looked up. "Why do you ask?" "I should have asked before." She considered this for a moment. "It was consuming," she said, "and very quiet, and I was proud of it, and no one thought to ask." The fire crackled. Outside, rain moved across the hills. "I am asking now," he said. She looked at him for a long moment with an expression he could not quite read. Not warmth, not quite, but something adjacent to it, something cautious and considering. Then she set down her book and told him about the first winter, and about James's difficult early months, and about the garden at the Hartwell country seat that she had redesigned entirely over 2 summers, because it had given her something to direct her hands toward her when the silence in the house became too wide to simply sit inside. He listened. He said nothing that was not called for. He simply listened. That was, he realized, quite possibly something he had never done before. On the 7th evening she laughed, a real laugh, unguarded, at something he said about his thoroughly incompetent attempts to fix the garden gate, which had been listing since his arrival and which he had now made noticeably worse. The sound of it stopped something in his chest. He had heard her polite laugh hundreds of times, in ballrooms, at dinner tables, in drawing rooms across London. He had never once heard this quick, entirely unperformed sound that had nothing in it of courtesy or management. When, he thought, with something that felt rather like grief, did I stop noticing the difference? The warmth of the fire, the rain against the small windows. Her voice, still faintly amused, saying something about the gate that he did not entirely hear because he was still thinking about the laugh, and about the 14 years, and about the specific and clarifying quality of sitting in a small Welsh cottage with a woman he had managed, for a very long time, not to see. Lady Constance Fairfax arrived on a Thursday. She came, ostensibly, from the nearby estate of a mutual acquaintance, and her arrival at the cottage gate, by private carriage, in a walking dress of extraordinary elegance entirely unsuited to a Welsh April, contained a degree of calculation that Dorothea, who recognized calculation, spotted immediately. Lady Constance was 41, beautiful in the particular way that requires considerable effort, and is most effective at distances below which that effort begins to show, and she had been the Duke's preferred social companion in London for the better part of 2 years. The sort of companion whose presence was observed and noted and commented upon in the drawing rooms of the Toll, and never quite confirmed or denied. Dorothea had observed this. She had done so with the particular composure of a woman who has long since made her peace with what her marriage is not. "Dorothea," said Lady Constance with a warm smile that touched nothing behind her eyes. "What a perfectly charming hiding spot. I had no idea." "We are not hiding," Dorothea said. "We are resting." Constance looked around the small sitting room with an expression of politely suppressed pity. "Of course you are. How cozy." She accepted the offered chair and arranged herself in it with the ease of a woman who arranges herself in rooms the way others arrange flowers, deliberately, for effect. I must confess I was rather surprised to hear Elliot had followed you all the way here. It must have been quite an adjustment. She smiled again. So different from what he's accustomed to. The two women were alone. Elliot had gone to the village on some errand. I imagine most things take adjustment, Dorothea said. Of course. Constance tilted her head, her voice dropping to something gentler, more intimate. I don't mean to suggest anything unkind. Only, well, you have managed so beautifully, haven't you, these years? On your own terms, in your own way. There is a certain dignity in that. A small pause, precisely weighted. Though I do sometimes wonder whether a woman of your particular stillness might find this sort of renewed attentiveness somewhat unexpected, even unsettling. Dorothea set down her teacup. I wonder, she said, whether you came all this way to say something more direct than that, or whether we are to spend the afternoon in this mode. Constance's smile held for a fraction of a second too long. I merely wanted to see that you were well. I am very well, said Dorothea, with absolute calm. Thank you for the visit. When Elliot returned an hour later, Constance had shifted her performance. Warmer, brighter, angled toward him with the practiced ease of long habit. He greeted her with cool courtesy and positioned himself, without appearing to be aware of doing so, on the far side of the room from her and in considerably closer proximity to Dorothea. He brought up her opinion on the essay she had been reading at dinner in front of Constance, with the specific animation of a man who has recently discovered a source of intelligence he cannot stop consulting. He listened to her answer. Constance watched this with a smile that did not entirely conceal what it was covering and departed by 4 o'clock, citing the drive back to her host's estate. She kissed the air beside Dorothea's cheek on her way out. Lovely creature, said Elliot after the carriage had gone. She came to assess the situation, said Dorothea. He looked at her very directly. I know. They stood in the small sitting room of the small cottage with the Welsh hills going dark outside the window, and the silence between them this time did not feel like 14 years of absence. It felt like the edge of something else. She was packing on the 11th day, not leaving, not exactly, not yet. But her fortnight was nearly over, and she had been putting things quietly and efficiently back into their places all morning, because this was what she did, and because if she had allowed herself to stop and examine what she was feeling, she was fairly certain she was not ready for what she would find. She heard him in the corridor outside the bedroom door. You're leaving, he said. My fortnight is ending. It ended 3 days ago. You stayed. He came to the doorway. He did not come further in, which was the correct instinct, and she noticed that he had, over 11 days, developed considerably better instincts than she had credited him with. Dorothea. She went on folding a shawl. I need to tell you something, he said, and I am not well practiced at this sort of thing, which you are aware of, and I would ask you to permit me to do it badly rather than not at all. She stopped folding the shawl. I did not follow you to Wales because I needed to retrieve you, he said. I followed you because I read your note and the house felt wrong in a way I could not identify, and I drove halfway across England before I understood that what I was feeling was that I did not want you to be gone. She turned to look at him, not as the Duchess of Hartwell, not as the person who ensures the correspondence is sorted and the household runs correctly. You, Dorothea. I drove to Wales because I did not want you to be gone, and I was not willing to wait a fortnight to tell you so. He paused. I'm telling you so now, approximately 11 days too late and rather badly. That is not a confession of love, she said very carefully. That is a confession of noticing an absence. You are right, he said. You are always precise, which I have apparently been observing for 11 days after 14 years of not observing it. So let me be precise as well. He moved then. Not closer. Not yet, but with a directness that held her still. I've watched you draw the same hills 6 mornings in a row, and each morning you find something different in them, and I did not know that about you. I've listened to you speak about things you care about. Your woolstone craft, your garden designs, your opinion of the wool policy, which is, incidentally, better reasoned than Lord Pemberton's. And I did not know that about you either. You laughed on the 7th evening about the garden gate. A real laugh. And I realized I had been hearing a different laugh for 14 years without knowing the difference. He stopped. His voice, when it continued, was quieter. I've lived beside you for 14 years, and I have been a fool in the specific way that men are fools. Not cruelly, but thoughtlessly, which is its own particular kind of damage. I cannot give you back those years, but I can ask you very directly and without pretense to give me the ones that remain. She was quiet for a long moment. You cannot follow someone to Wales, she said at last, and call it love. No, he agreed, but I can follow someone to Wales as the beginning of it. She looked at him. He met her eyes, really met them, without the distance that had lived there for 14 years. And she thought, this costs him something. He is not a man who asks. He has built his entire life around not having to ask. I want you to understand what you are asking, she said. Not the Duchess, not the arrangement, me, as I actually am. I am beginning to understand, he said, that you are considerably more than I had the sense to see. I would very much like to continue that education. The shawl was still in her hand. She set it down. You had better improve your tea, she said, if we are to do this properly. Something in his face shifted. Not a smile, quite, but the precursor to one, something private and unguarded that she had not seen in 14 years and did not intend to let him hide again. I will endeavor, he said, to become entirely competent at tea. She crossed the room to him. When he put his arms around her, it was careful, as though she were something he had been given the privilege of holding and was not yet entirely certain he had earned. She thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that this particular carefulness was worth more than all the easy affection she had ever watched other people perform across ballrooms. 14 years, she said against his shoulder. I know, he said. You owe me rather a lot of tea. A lifetime's worth at minimum, he agreed. And she felt his arms tighten, and outside the Welsh hills went quietly gold in the late afternoon light. They returned to London in early May. Dorothea had not expected society to notice. Society, as a general matter, noticed everything. What society noticed was this: that the Duke of Hartwell handed his Duchess down from the carriage with an attentiveness that was entirely unlike his previous habits, and that at the Ashworths' dinner 3 weeks later, he drew her into a conversation about parliamentary reform. Not to be polite, not to include her as an afterthought, but with the specific animation of a man genuinely seeking the opinion of someone whose mind he had recently discovered and could not stop consulting. And that Lady Constance Fairfax, who attended the same dinner, departed at 9 o'clock rather than her customary 11, and was not seen at any Hartwell event again that season. The Tun drew its conclusions. The Tun was, for once, entirely correct. It is 4 years later when the East Wing at Hartwell House acquires a purpose it has never had before. The room had been a spare bedroom, underused, north-facing, and always slightly cold. Dorothea had it cleared in June and the shelves taken out, and the light adjusted with a new set of windows that let in the particular quality of afternoon sun she wanted. Elliot, when he saw what she was making of it, said nothing except to ask whether the window situation was satisfactory. And when she said not quite, he had the glazier back the following Tuesday. It is her painting studio now. She works in it most mornings and some afternoons, and on rainy evenings when the light is insufficient, she uses the time to plan what she will paint when it returns. 2 of her pieces have been shown, privately, to people whose opinion she trusts, and they have said things she writes in the margins of her sketchbooks and returns to on difficult days. Elliot has begun to read her annotations. He does not comment on them in the mornings. He comments on them at dinner sometimes in his dry and particular way, and she argues back, and they have argued over 4 years about Wollstonecraft and wool policy, and the correct management of the Yorkshire tenancies, and about whether William's letters home suggest he is happy or merely being polite. And every argument is, in its own way, the best conversation she has ever had. He makes the tea now. He is, it must be said, still not entirely competent at it. He has improved considerably, but there is a particular stubbornness to his attachment to a method that does not quite work, and she corrects him each morning with the same dry precision, and he accepts the correction with the same expression that is not quite a smile. She has come to understand that this, too, is its own kind of devotion. One afternoon in October, 4 years after Wales, she comes downstairs from the studio to find him in the library. Not reading, papers set aside. Simply sitting in the chair he always chooses, by the window that looks over the garden she redesigned a decade ago. "You are not working," she says. "I was thinking," he says. "About what?" "About 14 years," he says, "and about Wales, and about the specific catastrophic quality of the garden gate, without which I might never have made you laugh." She sits down across from him. Outside, October light is moving quietly across the garden. "You would have found a way," she says. "Eventually." "I wonder," he says. "I was rather determined not to see what was directly in front of me." "You saw it in the end." "You had to leave," he says, "for me to understand the shape of the space you occupied." He looks at her in the way he has learned to look at her, directly, without the glass between them. I would prefer not to learn that lesson again. "Then don't," she says simply. He reaches across and takes her hand, and they sit together in the library of Hartwell House as the October afternoon settles around them, two people who spent 14 years in the same house as strangers and have spent 4 years making up for it with some urgency. "I love you," he says. "I know," she says. She had begun, finally, to believe it. The end. Dear listener, perhaps you know what it is to be perfectly present in a life that does not quite see you, to manage and arrange and hold everything together, and to do it so well that no one thinks to ask what it costs, to smile across a table at a gathering you planned, in a house you run, and feel beneath it all, like a woman quietly disappearing from her own story. Dorothea's courage was not in confronting anyone or demanding anything loudly. It was in the quietest, most difficult thing. She simply left. She went to be herself, alone, and trusted that if it mattered, something would follow. If you are 40 or 50, or somewhere beyond, if you have given years of yourself to others and find yourself wondering whether anyone has truly seen you in a very long time, you are not invisible. You have not missed your moment. You are not too much or too late or too worn from the years of managing. Dorothea's truest chapter began at 43, in a small Welsh cottage with bad tea and a garden gate that needed fixing. Yours may be closer than you think. Rest well tonight. The people who matter may simply need to notice the shape of the space you occupy, and when they do, they will come with love. From all of us at Fables of Love. Thank you so much for staying with us until the very end of this story. If it made you laugh, cry, or believe in love all over again, we would be so grateful if you liked this video, left a comment, and subscribed to the channel. Sharing it with someone who loves historical romance means the world to us and keeps our storytelling corner alive. Another story is waiting for you at the end of this video. Click, listen, and let your heart be swept away once more. From all of us at Fables of Love, thank you for being here.